I'm Alan Colmes. I want to welcome to our microphones Ted Cruz, Texas Senator, got a new book out called A Time for Truth, Reigniting the Promise of America. Senator, thanks so much for coming on the program tonight. Appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's great to join you.
There's so many nuggets in this book, one of which stands out is you as a Supreme Court clerk watching porn with Sandra Day O'Connor and William Rehnquist. That must have been a moment, right?
It was one of the more unusual experiences. When I came out of law school, I was a law clerk for Chief Justice Rehnquist, and it was 1996. It was right at the very beginning of the Internet, and the court had one of the very first Internet pornography cases. Justices didn't really know what the Internet was, and so the court librarians were setting up sessions to familiarize the justices with the Internet and how it worked. And so they set up a session, 2 justices at a time, and so the one that we participated in was Chief Justice Rehnquist and all of his law clerks, and Sandra Day O'Connor and all of her law clerks, and we were in a little room with the court librarian, and the librarian typed into a search engine with the filters off the word cantaloupe, misspelled. and it so happens, if you type that with no filters, the result is graphic, hardcore pornography.
Yeah.
And I still recall standing behind Justice Sandra Day O'Connor as we are together looking at pictures of porn, and her eyes kind of narrowed, and she turned her head down a little bit, and under her breath she simply muttered, "Oh my!"
I wish now. If only they had Instagram back then, where you could have captured the moment. You also, interestingly, you paint William Rehnquist. You tell some great stories about him being a much more jocular person than than his public image would have suggested.
He was a remarkable man. He was a very, very close friend and mentor. He was an enlisted man, and what a great statement that makes about our country. And I'll tell you, years later, when he was on the court, Lewis Powell had been a colonel in World War II. And so Justice Powell would occasionally kid the chief and say, I outrank you. And the chief very quietly would just say, not anymore.
There's some great stuff like that in the book. Let's talk about some of the issues you've raised lately. And having been a clerk on the court, you controversially have said that there should be retention elections for Supreme Court justices. But isn't the idea that you don't want the justices subject to the political whims? And if they don't vote the way you want, to get into that dynamic, wouldn't that be a problem?
Well, look, I would far rather the justices stay out of politics. In my view, a Supreme Court justice's responsibility is to follow the law and Constitution and not legislate their own policy positions from the bench. As Chief Justice Roberts famously put it in his confirmation hearing, to be umpire and not to root for one team or the other. Unfortunately, for many years, and in recent years it is only accelerated, the justices have not been doing that. They have been imposing their own policy preferences from the bench. And 2 decisions that embody that both occurred at the end of this term. The first was the Obamacare decision, where a majority of the court disregarded the language of federal law and effectively rewrote the statute of Obamacare in order to force that law on the American people. That's not the job of justices, to become partisans and change the law in order to seek a desired
Now, each side
outcome.
claims that the court does that, when it's a decision they don't like. Look at Bush versus Gore in 2000, and liberals would have said, oh, my God, they're legislating. They've decided who the next president is based on their preference.
Well, you're right. That accusation is made, and as you know, one of the things I describe in the book, A Time for Truth, is that I was a member of the litigation team of Bush versus Gore,
right,
and was down in Florida throughout that entire period. It remains one of the most extraordinary experiences I've ever been blessed to be a part of. You're right that both sides accuse any decision they don't like of being activism, but we just had a hearing that I chaired in the Senate Judiciary Committee, the subcommittee on oversight, on judicial activism. And judicial activism is not a decision with which you disagree. Judicial activism is a decision that disregards federal law or the Constitution. And that is an important distinction. You know, Bush versus Gore, I recognize that Democrats did not like the outcome of that decision. But it's also worth noting that in Florida, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 separate times they counted the ballots in Florida. And in all 4 times, George W. Bush won. Now, I've been on the winning side and losing side of elections, and winning is always favorable. People, partisans like that better. But at the end of the day, it is following the law to say that when you count the ballots, whoever has the most votes wins.
Ted Cruz is our guest. This new book is called A Time for Truth. You have been criticized for saying that the Obama team, the Obama White House, Obama, is the largest sponsor of terrorism based on the Iran deal. And in fact, Mitt Romney tweeted out, I'm opposed to the Iran deal, but Senator Ted Cruz is way over the line on the Obama terrorism charge. Hurts the cause. What do you say to Mitt Romney about that?
Well, I think truth matters. And I believe we have an obligation to speak the truth about the threats facing this country. Now here are the facts. Fact number 1, Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. Fact number 2, if the Obama nuclear deal goes through, over $100 billion under the control of the American government will flow directly to Iran. Fact number 3, if that occurs, a large portion of that money will be handed off to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, and to radical Islamic terrorists across the globe. And those jihadists will use the billions of dollars under the control of the United States government to murder Americans, Israelis, and Europeans. Those are the facts. The conclusion from those facts is that if this deal goes through, the Obama administration will become the world's largest financier of radical Islamic terror.
We don't know that's where the money would go, and certainly that deal the kibosh can be put on that deal anytime you want. And it wasn't just the Obama administration. As you know, the P5+1, the European Union, this is a multilateral agreement that has the entire Western world agreeing this is the best way to go.
All right, let's take those one at a time, because you had about 4 arguments there. Let's start with we don't know where that money will go. We absolutely know where that money will go. Iran is admitting they will continue to fund Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. They're not hiding it at all. Yesterday we had a hearing in the Senate Armed Services Committee. I asked the Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, is it true that Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism? Answer, yes, that is true. We know as a fact. Susan Rice, under questioning, John Kerry, under questioning, have both admitted, yeah, of course they will send some of that money to radical Islamic terrorists. And yet when I make that point, just a few days ago, President Obama, traveling to Africa, went out of his way to attack me personally to making that point. But, you know, it was interesting, Alan. But he didn't dispute the facts that I was saying. He didn't point to any other entity on the face of the globe that is sending more money to radical Islamic terrorists. Those are the simple facts, and the reason why, instead of defending the substance, the president attacked me personally, is because the deal, I believe, is indefensible on the merits. Indeed, in response to his attack directed at me, I invited President Obama to participate in a debate on the merits and substance of this deal at the time and place of his choosing, anywhere in the country, anytime in the next 60 days while Congress is assessing this deal. And if the president is unwilling to do so himself, he can send as his proxy John Kerry, the Secretary of State. But rather than engage in insults, we should talk about the substance of what the consequences will be of this catastrophic deal.
Ted Cruz, our guest, A Time for Truth, back in just a moment. Ted Cruz is our guest. His book is A Time for Truth. You've been siding with Donald Trump and invoking the 11th commandment as described by Ronald Reagan, thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican. Speaking of name-calling, you called Mitch McConnell a liar for not making a deal for a vote on the XM Bank. So is that hypocritical? Brit Hume took to Twitter to refer to you as hypocritical for that.
Well, you were right. That charge was leveled at me. I am a strong believer in Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment. Now, what does that mean? That means that you don't engage in personal attacks or ad hominems at other Republicans, or for that matter, in my time in the Senate, to the very best of my ability, I have not engaged in personal attacks or ad hominems on any senator, Republican or Democrat. What it doesn't mean, however, agree on substance. What it doesn't mean is you should refrain from speaking the truth. So, for example, on the battle that occurred in the Senate floor this week, I rose and gave an unusual floor speech in which I described the commitment that Mitch McConnell, the leader of my party, had made to me in front of every other Republican senator, that there was no deal to extend the Export-Import Bank, a quintessential example of corporate welfare. And that was a promise he had made to me in front of every other Republican senator at our lunch. And then his conduct on the Senate floor demonstrated that that promise was simply false. Now, in the course of doing so, describing the facts in a measured, matter-of-fact manner is, I believe, entirely consistent with civility and decorum. And it is markedly different from, with respect to Donald Trump, what many in the press wanted me to do is what a number of other Republicans had been doing, which is simply smack Trump with a stick. Tack, and I'm not willing to do so. Now, I will disagree with Republicans on policy. So, for example, I will disagree with Jeb Bush on questions of amnesty or Common Core. But at the same time, when reporters ask me to speak ill of Jeb Bush personally, I refuse to do so. Indeed, I praise Jeb Bush as a good man, someone I like, someone I respect, someone who I think was a good governor in Florida. Even for that matter, and this might surprise you, Alan, I have, to the best of my ability, endeavored not to speak ill of Barack Obama personally. I remember a couple of years ago I was doing a Sunday show, and the host asked me, you have said that Barack Obama is public enemy number one. And I actually stopped him. I laughed, and I said, I've never said that. I've never said anything of the sort. And in fact, I believe that President Obama is a true believer. I believe he believes passionately in government control of the economy, of redistribution of wealth. I think he is sincere in his beliefs. Now, I also believe his policy views are profoundly harmful to this country. The damage that has been done to working men and women, to young people, Hispanics, African Americans, single moms, people who are struggling to achieve the American dream. But even so, I have endeavored not to vilify any other individual personally, but rather to keep disagreement on substance. And I would note that's exactly what Reagan did. When Reagan laid out the 11th commandment, it didn't mean thou shalt never disagree with another Republican. Remember, Ronald Reagan had primaried Gerald Ford in 1976. He wasn't afraid of disagreeing with other Republicans. Now, he didn't attack Ford's character, but he did say we need to stand for principle.
Well, you know, when you call someone a liar, when you call someone a liar on the floor of the Senate, could that not be interpreted as an attack on one's character?
Well, what I did was describe, very matter of fact, this is the commitment he made. And then I described the conduct that he had carried out on the Senate floor moments earlier that was directly contrary to the commitment. That is speaking the truth about actions. It is, I believe, the responsibility of every elected official to speak the truth, to admit what is going on. And that is exactly what I did on the Senate floor.
We talked with Ted Cruz, Time for Truth, book just out. Really a fascinating read. Lots of great nuggets in there about how the system works. You know that you have a number of people who've gone after you because you don't play the game, you don't play the establishment game, and they've not been too kind to you in some of the statements you've had to weather. I wonder how you process that emotionally. Does it bother you at all?
Alan, it doesn't. I try to keep in mind who I'm working for, and I am elected to represent 27 million Texans, and I try to think of the men and women back home who, I think of little old ladies in East Texas who would grab me by the shoulder and they'd say, "Ted, please don't go to Washington and come one of them." And that's who I'm trying to keep my word to. What I've tried to do in Washington has really been two things: tell the truth and do what I said I would do. And it says something about Washington that those are viewed as such radical propositions. I will say to your listeners, what I try to do in the book, A Time for Truth, is take the readers behind closed doors to what's really happening in Washington. What's happening, the role of money, how it is corrupting Washington. I try to really highlight what I call the Washington cartel, which is career politicians in both parties who get in bed with lobbyists and special interests and grow and grow and grow government. And many of your listeners may come from a different spot in the political spectrum than I am, but I believe this book will give your listeners an insight into what's happening behind closed doors of the Senate, what's happening in Washington that's different from what they will hear elsewhere. And one of the things I'm not shy about doing is taking on my own party every bit as much as I'm willing to take on the Democrats and attempt to speak the truth.
Dan Coates, however, Senator of Indiana, accused you of revealing off-the-record discussions he says that undermines any sense of team spirit or cooperation. Are you guilty of that?
True, that the conversations that are held in the lunches are typically confidential. Indeed, in the book, I quote stories where multiple senators said, "Well, the conversations in our lunches are confidential, so I'll only do it if you let me be anonymous." I made an exception in this instance in the floor speech I gave last week because the majority leader had, I believe, done something extraordinary. He had looked me in the eyes. He had made a very direct promise that there was no deal to extend the corporate welfare that is the Export-Import Bank. And then his subsequent conduct demonstrated that this is something that has not happened to me in my tenure in the Senate other than this instance. And in my judgment, it was such an extraordinary breach of the candor and the trust that is required between each senator that I felt obliged to describe what had occurred. I will readily concede that is unusual. It is not something I'm typically willing to do. But in my judgment, this crossed the threshold to justify doing so.
Ted Cruz, our guest. We're talking to Ted Cruz, running for president, senator, Republican senator from Texas. His new book is called A Time for Truth. A couple other quick things. You speak very personally in your book about your family. You have a half-sister, Miriam, who sadly passed away within the last couple of years because of drug and alcohol addiction. How does that inform you on policy?
Well, I think all of us are really the product of our family journey. And as you know, my sister Miriam, she and I were very close. She led a troubled life. She struggled with the demons of alcohol and drug addiction most of her adult life. She unfortunately was in and out of prison, convicted of petty offenses, shoplifting, but she made poor choices, and she continued making poor choices. A number of us in the family tried repeatedly to help her straighten up her life, but she was not willing to change, and then she ultimately died of what the coroner concluded was an accidental drug overdose. That's hard. That's hard when you see people suffering. She was a single mom. She was someone with a good heart, but who made a lot of foolish decisions. And when I look at my family is a family that has struggled. My mom was born into a working class family where she became the first person in her family to go to college. She stood up to my grandfather, who was an alcoholic and a very difficult man. to go study math at Rice University and become a computer programmer in the 1950s. And my father came from Cuba, where he was imprisoned and tortured as a teenager, and fled to America with nothing. I mean, he had $100 in his underwear and washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. And all of that is an integral part of who I am, and for that matter, why I ran for office. Because when you have a family for whom freedom has been very personal and real, it underscores just how fragile what we have in America is. I feel incredibly blessed to be the child of an immigrant who fled oppression, because value the unique and extraordinary liberty that we have as Americans.
I know how much you love your dad, and it comes across very well in the book. He has himself made some controversial statements, like comparing Common Core to education standards that are Hitler-like. And I mean, do you ever wince and say, "Dad, please don't say that. You're going to hurt my chances"? Does that conversation ever take place?
Well, no, and I'll tell you that there has been an effort in the media and among some Democrats to try to paint a scary picture of my father. My father is an extraordinary man. He is a pastor. He is the most loving person I've ever known. And listen, his personal narrative poses a real threat to many on the left, because many on the left like to portray big government as the only solution to those who are struggling, who want to achieve the American dream. And the caricature they painted of him is simply false. And it is. So I'll give you an example. I'm not familiar with what you just mentioned there, but I'll tell you one of the most off-cited examples that gets repeated in the fever swamps of the internet.
Fever swamps.
Is that my dad has said President Obama should go back to Kenya. You can read that a lot.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Well, what actually happened, if you go to the video, my father was giving a talk, and he said President Obama should go back to Chicago. And someone in the audience calls out, "Back to Kenya." And my father laughed and repeated, "Back to Kenya," and kept going on. And in the context, anyone watching it, it was obvious him. And immediately the internet turns this into Pastor Cruz says Obama's from Kenya. It was silliness, and there's a reason they want to paint him as scary, because his personal narrative of starting with nothing and working hard to achieve the American dream runs counter to the story that many are trying to tell.
It's a great narrative, regardless of political ideology. Will you be the nominee?
I believe that I will. I'm very encouraged. We're seeing tremendous support. I can tell you, out of 16 Republicans, we have raised more money than any other Republican in the field in hard money. We raised $14.3 million that came from 175,000 contributions in all 50 states. People that came all over the country to tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org. The average contribution was $81, and I am very encouraged by the grassroots support. I think people are fed up with politicians who say one thing and do another, and they're looking for someone who'll tell them the truth and do what he said he would do, and that is what I have tried to do every day in office.
Would you consider Mr. Trump as your VP?
Well, let me win the nomination first, and then we'll focus on questions.
A quick thumbnail on Hillary Clinton, assuming she might be the person you would face if you were the nominee. What's your take on her? And I'll mention this. I'm going to have to pull out after this question. Sure.
I'm literally stepping on an airplane right now.
Yes, sir.
I believe the path to victory for Republicans in 2016, populist campaign of hardworking men and women across this country against the bipartisan corruption of Washington, D.C. And I think Hillary Clinton embodies the corruption of Washington, D.C. that keeps growing. the lobbyist and special interest at the expense of the school teacher, at the expense of the truck driver, at the expense of the steel worker, at the expense of all of the men and women across this country who are finding it harder and harder and harder to achieve the American dream.
Is she corrupt?
I think she is a creature of Washington. Hillary and Bill Clinton have made hundreds of millions of dollars exploiting their government service. And I do not believe she understands the single mom waiting tables, the truck driver struggling to make ends meet. In contrast, my parents went bankrupt when I was in high school. I took $100,000 in school loans to pay my way through school. I just paid off my school loan 6 years ago. I cannot wait to stage across from Hillary Clinton and talk about who understands the struggles of people who are filled with hopes and dreams and want to achieve the American dream, but are finding it harder and harder and harder under the constantly growing burdens coming from Washington. I think that will be a very stark contrast. And I believe the American people want to get back to an environment where our economy is growing, where jobs are plentiful, where young people come out of school and have 3, 4, 5 job offers, where we see wages going up instead of stagnating and going down, where we see more and more opportunity. I think that's a sharp contrast, and I think the American people will make a clear choice.
Senator Cruz, we really appreciate your time tonight. The book is called A Time for Truth, Reigniting the Promise of America. Thanks so much for your generosity of time.
Thank you very much, and God bless you, Alan.
Thank you very much. Senator Ted Cruz.